23-year-old Leah Roberts withdraws $3,000 and disappears into thin air. Off the back of a tragic couple of years, she embraces spiritualism and a love of travelling. But in March 2000, she set off from her North Carolina home on a road trip which she didn't tell a soul about. 4 days later, she's spotted at a restaurant thousands of miles away from her house, only for the next week to reveal her crashed car lying at the bottom of an embankment. The engine had been tampered with, and all her belongings were left inside. This is the case of Leah Roberts. Hi, I'm Cat, and welcome to my channel. I deliver cases to you in a dramatisation format, so if that's something you enjoy, you'll be happy to know we upload once a week. As always, my aim is to give a voice to the victims and remember them as they were. So with that, let us begin. Leah Toby Roberts was born on the 23rd of July, 1976, to Stancil and Nancy Roberts. She grew up in Durham, North Carolina, and had two older siblings, an older sister called Cara and an older brother called Heath. Durham was a mid-sized city, also known as the City of Medicine. This was because it was home to over 300 medicine and health-related businesses. It was a culturally rich area, popular with young families and professionals, and it had the right blend of urban and nature. Now, Leah was a very pretty girl. She had bright blue eyes, short sandy blonde hair, and a lovely smile. She had a beauty mark on her upper right lip and a surgical scar on her hip. All in all, Leah was known to be a very old soul. She was kind, empathetic, sensitive, and she was always willing to be a listening ear for others. But though she was very thoughtful, sometimes she could also be quite introverted, and this led to her closing off her feelings a lot of the time. Other things about Leah was that she was a vegetarian, she had a really strong southern accent, and she could speak Spanish fluently. She took up smoking in her young adult years. Now, Leah had a very close bond with her entire family. They were a tight family unit and they loved each other so much. And this was why they never could have predicted all the tragedies that would befall them. In 1993, when Leah was 17, her family was shocked to hear back from the doctors. They told them that her father had been diagnosed with a serious lung disease. But despite the turmoil that came with this serious news, Leah really did try to make the best out of life and kind of get on with it. Therefore, she did go on to college. Leah began college at the North Carolina State University. This was situated in Raleigh, which was around half an hour away from Durham. There, Leah majored in Spanish and anthropology. And for those of you who don't know, anthropology is the study of human nature. Unfortunately, on the 5th of February, 1997, during Leah's sophomore year, without any preparation or warning, Leah's mother Nancy died from heart disease. And this was an absolutely devastating blow for the family. Leah took some time off of college to grieve, but ultimately managed to convince herself to go back. But only just a year after, in the fall of 1998, Leah was involved in a very serious car accident. It was completely lethal and Leah was absolutely lucky to have got out of it alive. The recovery from the crash turned out to be a long process. From it, Leah came out with a punctured lung and a shattered leg. Surgeons implanted a metal rod next to Leah's femur to help it grow properly, and so after all of this, Leah recovered at home and her family took really good care of her. She worked back towards everyday life with an incredible amount of grit and determination. Without having the stress of recovery, Leah could then look back on the accident quite thoughtfully. I mean, she really specifically focused on the part of how it had been such a near-death experience and just the odds of her surviving it were so slim. And the whole experience just made Leah feel reborn again. It was after this she immersed herself in spirituality. During this new lease of life that Leah obtained, She also went on to play soccer, and she was offered an opportunity to study in Spain for the semester. Now, as the spring of 1999 came around, Leah was offered a chance to go to Costa Rica for a field programme. And she was really excited for this, considering she had had such a fun time in Spain. But 3 weeks before she was due to leave, her and her siblings were tested again. On the 19th of April, Stancil Roberts passed away due to complications with his lung disease. This was only 2 years after his wife, Nancy Roberts. Now, her father's death wasn't as sudden as the mother's, and in some ways the siblings had seen this coming for a while. Obviously, Leah was devastated, but her siblings still encouraged her to go on the trip to Costa Rica. They said it would be a perfect opportunity for her to clear her head and just process everything that had happened. And all things considered, Leah did really want to go, and she'd been looking forward to that trip for a long time. Now, since Leah would be leaving the country for a bit and she didn't live with parents anymore, she handed over a power of attorney to her older sister Cara, which meant Cara had control of all her bank accounts. So in Costa Rica, Leah had a wonderful time. It was as great as she imagined. But while she was there, she kind of underwent another personal transformation. The trip had really opened her eyes and taught her that life was this absolute adventure. She really did want to see the world, and she didn't want to be confined by the traditional educational path that had been set out for her in the first place. Consequently, against her older siblings' wishes, Leah dropped out of North Carolina State University, just a semester short of graduation. And her siblings weren't too harsh on her about it. They were just worried, because unlike how Leah was experiencing things, they didn't really think she was actually on the up after their parents' deaths. They were worried that she kind of felt very lost and directionless. Though they soon observed the change, and then in hindsight perhaps it was a good idea to let Leah have this independent control over her life, because she became more mature, and ultimately more introspective. I mean, she liked to look at the deeper meaning of everything. During this more enlightened period of her life, Leah took up guitar, learned photography, and even adopted a blonde kitten that she named Bee. Not to mention, Leah started branching out her social life more. She would often go to the local coffee houses where she would meet friends, and while she was there, she often liked to write poetry talking about the meaning of life. The two notable friends she made was one called Janine Quiller, and when she consequently moved into her own place in Raleigh, a roommate called Nicole Bennett. Now, with the two girls, Leah started to talk about a certain love of hers. It was a passion she had developed recently, and it was just something that really inspired her. She was absolutely obsessed with it. Specifically, Leah was fixated on emulating a man called Jack Kerouac. He penned the book Beat Generation. Jack was a novelist who went on a road trip himself to the West to kind of find himself and his purpose in life. Delving more into Jack's work, Leah found that her favourite book of his was called The Dharma Bums. The story was one that encouraged the reader to leave behind their modern life and forego all materialism. Part of the book takes place at a forest fire lookout on Desolation Peak near Mount Baker, Washington. So on the morning of the 9th of March 2000, Leah spoke to her sister Cara on the phone. And during this conversation, Leah seemed uncertain about her future plans, but regardless, she eventually hung up on Cara and said that she would see her soon. Later in the early afternoon, Nicole reminded Leah that the next day they were scheduled to be babysitting someone. And Leah told her, yeah, it was fine, she would be there, she remembered. And that afternoon, Leah was fine, she was acting normally. There were no big changes in her behaviour. That day, Leah was dressed up with lots of jewellery on. She wore a pair of 14-carat gold earrings with ruby stones and 3 rings on her right hand, one of which was a 14-carat white gold ring set with an emerald-cut diamond. The other 2 were set with baguette diamonds. So Nicole left for work, and then when she returned later, she found that Leah's white 1993 Jeep Cherokee was missing, which was strange because at no point Leah had mentioned that she was going out. And when Nicole went inside, there wasn't any sign of Leah, but as she looked around the house, Leah had left her a note, but also a month's worth of rent money. On the note, Leah told Nicole that she wouldn't be back for a few weeks. Leah also stated that she wanted to go on a road trip, like her favourite author Jack, and that she was ready to find her purpose again. Nicole also realised that Leah had taken her kitten B with her. Now, because Leah wasn't really known to maintain a specific schedule, Nicole initially wasn't very concerned. Leah had always been free-spirited and she always wanted to be on the move. During the evening of the 11th of March, and now this was 2 days after Leah had set off on her unplanned road trip, Nicole really was starting to get concerned now, and so was the rest of Leah's family and friends. A lot of them just wanted to check in with her and call her and just make sure she was alright. But none of them could get through. She didn't reply to anyone. So after 2 more days of not being able to get into contact, on the 13th of March, Cara called the police and reported Leah missing. The next day on the 14th, whilst the police got their investigation underway, Cara and Nicole went into Leah's room to see if they could find more information on her mental state or why she had left so suddenly. And during this search, they found that many of Leah's clothes were missing from her room and that she'd left another note on her desk. On the note, there was clear writing that read, "I'm not suicidal, I'm the opposite." She mentioned Jack Kerouac again and also included a drawing of the Cheshire Cat's grin. For those who might not know, the Cheshire Cat was the cat that would come and go in Alice in Wonderland. The films and the books were a favourite of Leah's. The rest of the note was kind of like a signing off letter. It wasn't distressed and the tone was really casual, and it went like this. "Nicole, this is to cover the bills for while I am gone. Remember, everyone is together in thoughts and prayers and time passes quickly. Have faith in me, yourself, everyone. Help Shep with Easter at Larter House for fun for the children. Give Peter my laptop. Give everyone my love. See you soon. Tell Cara don't worry, even if she will. Leah. P.S. Cookies in the freezer." There were other things circled on the page too, such as, "Tell Nikki I meant to come, but I had no choice. She'll understand. Tell Melissa she should come stay in my room if she wants to come to Raleigh." Now, since Cara still had the power of attorney over Leah's bank accounts, she was able to access all her financial transactions. Through this, Cara had discovered that just before Leah had left North Carolina, she withdrew $3,000 from her bank account. Later that day, she then used her debit card to pay for a motel in Memphis, Tennessee. This would have been considered a long first leg for an unplanned trip. Approximately, to get from North Carolina to the Memphis area, it would take around 11 hours. Cara also found in the records that there were later transactions of Leah purchasing food and gas. And the location of these suggested that Leah was originally travelling west up Interstate 40 until it ended in California, and then she headed north on Interstate 5. The last activity on her bank accounts was to purchase gas. This was on the 13th of March, just after midnight, and this was 4 days into her impromptu road trip. Whilst her siblings looked over her bank accounts, they kept trying to get in contact with Leah, but again, it was just absolute silence on her end. When the police would look at Leah's phone records later, they would realise that her phone hadn't been used since she left North Carolina. And so at this point, they didn't know if she had turned it off and was refusing to take calls, or if her phone wasn't actually on her person. By taking note of where one of the transactions took place, the police managed to pull security footage from a gas station in Brooks, Oregon. In this video, which was just before 1 a.m. on the 13th of March, Leah looked to be in good condition and wasn't distressed. She didn't seem hurt or disorientated. There was a few times in the video where she kept peering over her shoulder into the parking lot while she was trying to draw out money. But the police didn't specifically think that this was suspicious because it was so late at night, and because she was a young woman, it would be natural for her to be feeling anxious being on her own. With no further leads in her case, because at this point most of her travelling had been done by car, progress slowed down. Because she was on a road trip, presumably to get to Desolation Peak, Brooks, Oregon couldn't be the final search area, because for all the police knew, Leah was still on the move. But Leah's case took a dramatic turn when in Washington, the Whatcom County Police Department got a call. This phone call was from a couple who had been out jogging. They had been running along Canyon Creek Road, which was basically a side route of the Mount Baker Highway. But as the couple travelled, they noticed that random articles of clothing had been tied to the trees. This was at the side of the road, where it kind of curved to the right at the top of a slope. So the couple stopped, investigated further, and as they looked down, right to the bottom of the embankment, they saw a crashed vehicle. They told all this to the authorities, and bearing in mind at this point, the local police were on the lookout for Leah Roberts because they knew she was on a road trip and that she would likely be passing through their state. And so they soon managed to make a connection. The car crashed at the bottom of the embankment was Leah's white 1993 Jeep Cherokee, abandoned. The police immediately set out to take a look, and very quick into investigation, they deduced that Leah was nowhere to be seen around her car. You see, the vehicle was badly damaged, but there were certain tells and aspects which suggested to the police that not all was what it seemed. So firstly, based on the path that the car took when it went through all the trees, and then the amount of damage it took when it came off the embankment, the Washington State Patrol estimated that the Jeep had to have crashed over at approximately 40 miles per hour. All of Leah's personal belongings were in there, including clothes, money, her CDs, her guitar, a checkbook, and her means of identification. And these things had been tossed around a lot inside, which was very consistent with a multiple rollover, which is likely what the car did after it took the plunge. And so, if you had heard of this crash, and let's say for example you didn't know that it was related to Leah's case, you would think that anyone who was in the vehicle at the time, well, they'd either be seriously injured or deceased. It's not definite someone could get out of a car that quick before it went over, and the car was really banged up, so someone couldn't have come out of it without a deadly accident. But there was nothing, no signs to suggest that Leah was ever in the car when it went over the embankment. There was no signs of blood, and definitely no signs of injury.
You would anticipate some type of injury to the person inside. If there was no injury to the person inside, at least some type of evidence to indicate contact damage that the person had been inside the vehicle. But none of those signs were evident.
So this got the police into thinking that no one had been behind the wheel when the car went over, and that it must have been purposely pushed off. This was further backed up when they found that there was no shattering of glass, which you would expect if someone hit their head on the windshield or something. And then there was also the seatbelts. Seatbelts are meant to keep the passenger in, but there was no evidence that the seatbelts had been strained or lengthened. Consequently, to investigators, it was looking more and more like this whole crash and this whole scene with the article of clothing had been meticulously staged. Other strange details about the car included the state of the inside, because in the inside, pillows and sheets were hung up, covering all the windows, which kind of made it seem to the police like the car had been used as a shelter temporarily before it had crashed. There were also bits of cat food, and a cat carrier still in the vehicle, which confirmed that Leah definitely took B with her, but B was also nowhere to be found. All of her valuables, such as $2,500 in cash and her jewellery, were left behind untouched. So this automatically told the police that the motivation for the crash hadn't been the robbery. When Carr and Heath were given back Leah's personal effects, they sorted through them themselves, and one thing they did come across was a camera with an undeveloped roll of film. Her siblings thought it might hold some clues, but unfortunately it was just pictures of the previous winter, nothing to do with Leah's current road trip. But what stuck out to Carr and Heath the most was the newly brought items, alongside Leah's possessions. This gave them a much clearer picture of what Leah had been doing while she was in Washington. There was a ticket stub from the 13th of March for a showing of American Beauty at a theatre in Bellingham, Washington, specifically Bellis Fair Shopping Mall, and this was for about 2:10 p.m. The ticket now confirmed that Leah's last known location was Bellingham, and coincidentally, Bellingham was an hour away from the Mount Baker crash site. So from Brooks, Oregon to Bellingham, Washington, it would have been around a 5 to 6 hour drive. Leah was around Brooks at 1 a.m, so it makes sense to believe that she would have arrived in Bellingham at around 6 a.m to 7 a.m. And so then she was apparently planning to see American Beauty at 2 p.m. And this does make me question Leah's mental state at the time she was travelling. Because if you'd spent all that time travelling in the early morning hours, the first thing you'd want to do when you stop somewhere is to sleep. And if she did do that, it wouldn't have been very long until she had to get up and then get ready again to go to the theatre. So her actions this day just seem very frantic. So after this discovery, Carr and Heath got in contact with the police, kind of told them what they knew, and then together they all flew out to Bellingham. Whilst they were there, Carr and Heath visited the crash site, as well as going around Bellingham putting up missing persons flyers. They did this with the help of the local sheriff's department. They also went into local businesses and asked customers and owners if they could recall having seen Leah on the 13th of March. And the situation was kind of getting stranger and stranger, because Leah had been on this big, long road trip, and she'd barely spent any of her money. She hadn't been paying for motels or anything. So where had she been staying while she was in Bellingham? Was this why her car kind of looked like a shelter? Near the theatre, where Leah was intending to go to, was the local mall's only sit-down restaurant. Carr and Heath believed that Leah might have gone there for a meal. So the police went into this restaurant, which was called the Elephant and Castle, and they interviewed various customers and members of staff. Through this, 2 individuals yielded information on Leah. These 2 men had indicated that they had met Leah in the restaurant, and whilst she was up at the counter, they were sitting on either side of her, and they got to talking. They recalled that Leah had been in really good spirits that day, and was just constantly saying about the reason why she was on this entire road trip to begin with. Specifically, the men mentioned the name Jack Kerouac, so to the police this was definitely a valid sighting. One of the men claimed that when he had finished speaking to Leah, she left the restaurant with a 3rd man. He heard her call him Barry. Apparently, the witness didn't actually know this Barry, but he was able to provide the police with enough details for them to kind of make a sketch. However, what's interesting about this is that when they interviewed the other witness separately, he contradicted everything his friend said, and he said that he didn't know a Barry and there was no Barry. And this backed up the police's lack of progress, because obviously they had gone away and they tried to search for this elusive Barry because they had his image but they had no details, and they just couldn't find anything from anyone in the area or their database to suggest that Barry ever existed. Interestingly, not even a few days into the initial search of Bellingham and the discovery of Leah's car, the Whatcom County Sheriff's Office received a peculiar call. It was a man who wanted to stay anonymous, but he claimed that his wife had seen Leah, and this was a complete chance sighting, but during this time she looked disorientated and distressed. Apparently this was at a gas station in Everett, which was relatively close to Seattle. This was an hour south of Bellingham. After disclosing this information, the man panicked like he shouldn't be doing this right now, and he hung up. And the connection had been cut off so quick that the police didn't even get to see what his name was. To this day, the police consider the tip to be credible. A month later, in April 2000, the police persistently searched around the Jeep's crash site for Leah. Dogs trained to sniff out corpses were brought in, as well as metal detectors, in the hope that perhaps they could find the metal rod in Leah's leg. There was also helicopters used in the search, but despite all this, no new evidence was recovered. At this point, whilst the investigators examined the Jeep further, they were joined by the FBI. And the reason the FBI got involved at this point was because Leah's case had technically transpired over several states. Together, the two departments eventually managed to unearth a ring, which belonged to Leah's mother. It was her engagement ring. It was lodged under the floor mat inside the vehicle, and this was something really precious to Leah. She wore it all the time. I mean, you really have to understand that it was always on her being. She would never take it off because it was one of the deepest connections she had to her late mother. And her family and her friends made sure that the police knew this. After the discovery of the ring, unfortunately the investigation stalled. A year later, in 2001, Unsolved Mysteries ran a segment on the case which generated new tips for the investigators. Some of these reports were that Leah had been sighted elsewhere in the US, but the police didn't think that any of these were credible. Then 4 years later, in 2005, Monica Kaysen, a woman from Wilmington, who helped other families find their missing loved ones, became involved in Leah's case after being contacted by Cara. Kaysen, with the help of a network of volunteers, called Community United Effort, specialise in keeping cold cases alive in the media, even when official investigations have ceased. Shortly after Kaysen was enlisted, she organised a caravan across the country. This followed Leah's route west to Bellingham.
And her case is the inspiration for the Q Center's annual road tour. Now, volunteers set out on a grueling journey, bringing attention to other unsolved cases, including some from right here in North Carolina.
We decided to do was sit down with the authorities, and we came up with her credit card statements, which she had used the whole entire way. And we decided we were going to go to every place that she stopped, put up posters, bring a renewal to the effort of looking for her, let people know she was missing.
The road tour kicks off later this week.
It was obviously done to raise awareness of not only Leah's case, but also other missing persons cases. It has now become an annual event. Also, during the summer of 2005, volunteers from a North Carolina missing persons awareness group organised a separate caravan across the country to bring even more awareness to Leah's case and also other missing persons cases in the North Carolina area. A year later, in 2006, Mark Joseph of the Whatcom County Sheriff's Department passed on Leah's case after having been the one who had initially investigated it. The case was passed down onto two younger detectives that he really rated. This was Detective Collins and Detective Smith. While reviewing the case in 2007, one of the detectives noticed at the time, when Leah's Jeep was pulled from the embankment, it wasn't properly processed. There was still some evidence that hadn't been obtained. After deciding to re-examine the vehicle, the detectives popped the hood and they saw that indeed a wire had been cut. This would have easily have allowed the car to accelerate without even having to press down on the gas pedal. Not only this, but the cover for the starter relay had also been removed. This would also allow the car to accelerate on its own, as long as someone could quickly nip in to kind of put the key in the ignition. So these discoveries confirmed early suspicions that the car had definitely been tampered with and was wrecked on purpose. But even more amazingly, the detectives managed to find a fingerprint under the hood of the Jeep and a sample of unidentified male DNA on an article of Leah's clothing. Now, when the detectives looked over who had previously been interviewed in regards to Leah's case, they came across one individual in particular that kind of piqued their interest. This was the man who claimed that Leah had gone off with Barry. This was because of his particular professional background. Because the things that were done to Leah's car were really advanced. It means someone really had to know their way around the vehicle. Consequently, this man did have this required type of knowledge because he was a mechanic in the military. So at this point, police thought he was a valid suspect. Plus, no one could corroborate his story of Barry, so the police went ahead and took his fingerprints and some DNA. This eventually ruled out his involvement in her disappearance. The fingerprint sample did not match, but as for the results of the DNA, that has never been disclosed by the police. In an absolutely bizarre twist of events, in 2014, a mummified body was found around the area where Leah's Jeep had crashed. And there was specific interest around this body because this person had a metal rod in their leg in the same place as where Leah's had been. As her family and the public hung on for more details to be revealed about this unidentified body, it soon came out that the individual was a man, about 5'5", and between the ages of 33 to 55, which ironically was actually quite similar to Leah's height of 5'6". But one of the things that blows my mind is the eerie coincidence that follows this. Because allegedly, web sleuths managed to track back the serial number of the male's metal rod, and what they found was shocking. So not only did this man have the same type of surgery as Leah, he had it on the same day and in the same leg. The two metal rods came from the same batch, so it's absolutely unbelievable that this person's body was found in the same area that Leah had gone missing. It is worth noting that the family of the unidentified individual are no longer willing to give out any details, and that obviously is completely understandable. And now, as we all know, at this point in my case, I tend to like to go into theories. And I have to stress that these theories are not fact, they're opinion which has been based off research I've done to the best of my ability. The first theory is that the whole thing was staged by Leah, and henceforth this means that it could have been a voluntary disappearance. I mean, she really admired Jack Kerouac and she wanted to do the same things that he had done. Like him, she went on the road trip, leaving all material aspects behind. But perhaps she took his words more literally than people thought, and perhaps used this new enlightenment of hers to start a new life. Evidence suggested that the car was rolled off and that no one was sitting inside of it at the time. Plus, she was talking about Jack with the people she had come across on her road trip, and her car was found around the Mount Baker vicinity, which directly links back to her favourite book of Jack's. But then again, if this was all staged, it was certainly made to be as dramatic as possible, especially if she'd gone to all the trouble of writing a note, leaving it for her roommate and her sister, and then letting all her belongings fall with the car. And I just don't think this sounds like Leah. She was soft and she was gentle and she didn't want to hurt anybody. And we have to remember her note specifically said that she wasn't feeling suicidal or overwhelmed. Her siblings adamantly believe that this is not a viable theory. They just don't believe she would be capable of something like that, and basically put them through even more tragedy than they'd already been through in their lives. They just didn't perceive Leah as being that selfish. Plus, perhaps the bigger counter-argument to this of all was the fact that the engagement ring was still in the car. No matter Leah's intentions on the trip, that ring meant the absolute world to her. Her siblings stated that it just held too much sentimental value, she would not leave it behind. Then there's also the officers, and so in terms of when they speak about searching for Leah, they kind of refer to it as finding her remains, which seems the police have disregarded this theory too. The second theory is homicide, and perhaps has the most evidence to back it up, despite there not being a body. There were several strange aspects about the case. There was not only DNA on the car, but DNA on her clothes, and that hasn't even been identified yet. And then, who is Barry? Does the DNA and the fingerprint belong to Barry, or is he just a creative figment of someone's imagination? The man who spoke of Barry has the required mechanical knowledge to tamper with Leah's car if he really wanted to. Was Barry just a red herring for the police to follow? And because of his previous chats with her, he knew about the road trip and why she wanted to do it. Did he potentially do something to Leah, then take her car and then drive all the way up to Mount Baker? Was this an attempt to make it all seem like Leah had done it on purpose? And what of the pillows and the sheets in the car? Were they put up by Leah, or were they put up by someone else? And again, intent is key. The jewellery and the money were left behind, so it clearly wasn't financially motivated. But the fingerprints didn't match up though, although obviously the DNA sample hasn't been disclosed. Perhaps the police can only go further with the homicide theory if they ever find the body. The third theory is suicide, because technically Leah wouldn't have needed to go over the embankment with the car if she wanted to end her life. And obviously she wasn't in there because there was no sign of any blood. Perhaps she simply let her car roll off the embankment. But if she was feeling particularly depressed, I don't get what the point would be for her car to just be completely destroyed like that. And then, did she even have enough vehicle knowledge to be able to tamper with everything in the way that it was? But if we go with the reasoning that perhaps maybe Leah was capable of doing something to her car, and that she was the one who led it off the embankment, then did she perhaps go somewhere more hidden to end her life? I mean, the location of where the car was, near Mount Baker, was this sprawling national park, so there were a lot of places to go if you didn't want to be found. Plus, she went missing as a young adult. That is recognised by scientists and psychologists to be an age where people are most likely to develop some type of mental issue or suffer from a mental break. She'd suffered through so much tragedy in her life, perhaps it was just too much for her to take. Her final note sounded upbeat, and was that because she knew what she had planned? Though it is worth noting that before this, even during the darkest periods of Leah's life, she never regressed, she always went forward with life. In fact, she always went on a journey of self-improvement. That doesn't sound like the actions of someone who's suicidal. And she loved her kitten. If she wasn't returning, why didn't she just leave Bee behind? You know, then you could presume that Bee would be being looked after by either her roommate or her sister. All in all, everyone who knows Leah believes that she underwent this trip with the best intentions. Likely just wanted to get some further inspiration from life. This case remains one of the most puzzling disappearances, in which investigators just don't understand why Leah can't physically be found. The reports say that officers are resolute that her remains are likely somewhere in the area, so they clearly think she didn't start a new life. Leah's case is still open and active. She is missed by both her family and her friends, and they one day hope that they will get definitive answers. I, for one, really hope this case gets solved. The number to call with further information is 360-778-6600. Thank you for watching. Comment down below what you think happened to Leah Roberts.